Now, I said what we today call the secular state. I've mentioned a few times that I did, when I finished my doctorate this summer, I did it at the University of Nottingham, and one of the um, kind of important theologians who, until very recently, taught at Nottingham was John Milbank, and Milbank was one of my examiners. And Milbank, in his book Theology and Social Theory, really caused quite a stir a number of years ago when he published that book. And the first line of that book is, once there was no secular. And what he meant by that, and this became an important theme in a lot of contemporary theology and political theology, is the idea that our modern notion of some kind of division between sacred and secular is really artificial and is simply a product of modernity, and is a very recent innovation that until very recently in most of human societies throughout the world didn't really exist. People, both outside the Christian West and certainly within the Christian West, had what we might call an enchanted worldview. And by enchanted, we don't mean sort of, pretty and delightful and enchanted. It may have been that at some points, it may not at other points, but the idea that what we today in modern terms call the supernatural, the divine presence, evil presence, and so on and so on, pervade all of reality, and you can't tear those things apart. And as we'll see as we go through this a little bit, that really was true in Christian thought in many respects, again, up until some relatively recent thinking and theorizing about it. And as I mentioned, now there is increasing, I don't know about increasing, but there is theological pushback about whether that's the right way to think about it. So one initial thought about this might be to ask the question that our text asks, which is, how can the state be distinguished from the concept of society? Is there a difference between this concept of state and this concept of society? And the text suggests that one way we might think about this is that the state is a seat of political power and authority, whereas society is not in itself an institution. Society might include institutions, say an educational institution like a theological seminary, or an institution like the family, and so on. But society as a whole is much broader than the concept of state as a seat of political power and authority. So that's potentially one way to think about a possible distinction. The idea of the modern nation state, the idea that state as a seat of political power and authority is located within sovereign nations that have their own set borders and territories, that have their own ability to decide what forms of government they want to adopt, that have their own ability to decide matters of the relationship of the political authority and religion, whether there is no relationship or is a formal relationship, have their own authority to develop, use particular kinds of laws, or have constitutional authorities. All of these are modern concepts, and we can most immediately trace those concepts back to developments that occurred after the wars of religion in the 17th century. If you take a church history class, you will study the wars of religion, and this is a period kind of in the immediate aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, and you've got a difficult intertwining of princes and kings and rulers with the religious authorities. And there had been a long history before the Protestant Reformation of the extent to which in the Christian West, which is where the Reformation occurred, the extent to which the papacy had authority over temporal affairs, or only over spiritual or churchly affairs. And there was a lot of back and forth over centuries about that. And there were periods when the papal authority was very high, and there were periods when the papal authority was very low. There were periods when the papacy was divided. There were periods when the popes were in exile. And all of those sort of crises form actually part of the backdrop of the Reformation. Now, in the Reformation period, the magisterial reformers, Calvin and Luther and their immediate followers, made clear that secular authority, state authority, I should say, temporal authority, temporal governance still matters and still is ordained by God, but that the religious authority, and in particular the papacy, should not be able to exercise its authority directly over those state authorities. And, intertwined with all of that history were some princes who were, for their own political and economic and other reasons, very desirous of getting out from under any presumed power of the papacy. So some of those aligned themselves with Protestant factions. Others remained loyal to or aligned themselves with Catholic factions. And war raged throughout Western Europe. The 30 Years' War, which, by definition ranged about 30 years, was a completely devastating affair, as devastating in its time and in the consciousness of people in and around that time as World War I and World War II were in their times. Now, of course, World War I and II, in absolute terms, many, 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 many more people died. There was much more destruction. They were much bigger. The engines of war were much bigger. But kind of in relative terms, the 30 Years' War and other related wars really devastated the European people, the European countryside, European stability, and they eventually led to a series of peace treaties among these different Catholic and Protestant aligned princes that are called the Peace of Westphalia. So this picture is from this painting is from the signing of one of those key peace treaties. So a couple of just terms that you ought to be aware of from the Peace of Westphalia. Now, one thing the Peace of Westphalia does is it goes back and honors an earlier peace accord from some earlier conflicts that had their roots in the same kinds of causes, both ecclesial causes and temporal causes relating to money and territory and things like that. But some of the key terms: each prince has the right to determine whether his state is Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist. Those were, by the way, pretty much the only options at the time. And those were the basic alignments of most of the warring princes. So the prince can decide that question, and that is an enormous kind of concession, an enormous development from the prior history of Christendom in the West, which was always presumptively and politically Catholic. Minorities, meaning minority religious persons, meaning, if you're a Catholic in a Lutheran territory or Lutheran in a Calvinist territory, under the Peace of Westphalia, would have the right to practice their faith during set hours. The state would circumscribe the hours in which there could be official church services or in private. And there was a recognition of national sovereignty. So each of the particular territories ruled by these princes, which are making these determinations, are now beginning to be recognized as national sovereigns, with their own borders, with their own ability to decide forms of government, with their own rulers, with emissaries who had the right of letters of marque, in other words, diplomatic immunities when traveling back and forth through other territories. And this concept is really the root of our current concept of the nation state, the United States of America or Mexico or Canada or Russia or whatever, these separate states with their own laws and their own rulers. And it's also the beginnings of concepts of kind of modern concepts of international law as a form of law that kind of mediates between or adjusts the relationships among these different states. I do want to note one thing here. I say wars of religion in that third bullet point, and I do put that in scare quotes for a reason, because there's some really good scholarship in recent years. One of the writers mentioned in this chapter in our text is William Cavanaugh, and Cavanaugh wrote some important work on the question of whether the wars of religion were really about religion or whether they were really primarily about other kind of typical things that wars have always been fought about, territory, money, and the like. So there's a lot of debate in the scholarship about the actual cause of the wars of religion and whether it's really right to call them wars of religion. In the popular consciousness, in our own modern concepts, even in our own American constitutional law concepts of the difference between church and state, the wars of religion, the 30 Years' War and other wars around that period, still remain very important as a backdrop. So when we talk about the need to keep the state neutral in terms of religion to avoid a state going to war in the name of religion, this is a very important backdrop to that. So the historiographic question, I think, is really an interesting and important one. If you take my church history class, I talk about this some more. I mean, I suppose I personally hold, I'm not an expert in this period, but I personally hold somewhat of a position in the middle, I suppose. I think those wars were political in a classical sense, that is, they were about territory and money and power, but I think there also were religious passions that really fueled them. There was real hatred between and among many of the Catholics, Lutherans, and Protestants, and that certainly added fuel to it. And in any event, without doubt, it is a black blot on the history of Christianity that there were wars that couldn't be resolved in some other way. In any event, what I want you to see on this slide, and for the purpose of this class, is this concept of the state. So even our whole problem that we're addressing in this chapter, and this question of good order in contemporary terms, is in many ways a relatively modern problem that would not have occurred in precisely the same way during earlier periods.